Somewhere in a Chicago office tower right now, a 26-year-old junior analyst is opening a spreadsheet that used to take her 3 days to build. It takes her 40 minutes. She doesn't know it yet, but the version of her job that existed 2 years ago is already gone, and the version that exists now is on a countdown. This isn't a prediction about some distant future. It's happening in the first half of 2026, in real buildings, to real people, and the man who runs one of the most powerful AI companies on Earth is the one telling you to pay attention. His name is Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, and in the spring of 2025, he said something that most CEOs building this technology were only willing to say in private. He told Axios that AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs within 5 years, and that unemployment among young workers could climb to somewhere between 10 and 20%. He wasn't hedging. He named the industries: finance, law, consulting, technology, and he named a window of time. Amodei has described a scenario where the economy grows at 10% a year, cancer gets cured, budgets balance, and 1 in 5 people still don't have a job. That single sentence captures the entire paradox of this moment better than almost anything else being said in public right now. Prosperity and mass joblessness arriving at the exact same time, caused by the exact same technology. A year later, in early 2026, Amodei doubled down. He published a 20,000-word essay warning that AI systems capable of out-reasoning Nobel laureates could arrive within a year or two, and he repeated the 50% jobs claim, calling this moment a kind of rite of passage for the species. Around the same time, MIT researchers using a tool called the Iceberg Index found that AI can already technically perform roughly 7% of the U.S. labor market, representing about $2 trillion in wages concentrated in finance, healthcare, and professional services, and the visible layoffs making headlines account for only a small slice of that total exposure. Most of it is happening quietly underneath the surface in HR departments, logistics teams, and back office administration where nobody is filming a press conference about it. Here's what makes this wave different from every automation panic that came before it. When factories automated in the 20th century, a laid-off machinist could retrain into a service job, a warehouse job, an office job. The cognitive work was still safe because computers couldn't think. That escape hatch is closing. Amodei has put it plainly: this isn't a technology replacing one job. It's a general labor substitute that can touch finance, law, consulting, and tech simultaneously, which means a displaced worker has fewer adjacent fields to run to. A factory worker replaced by robots could, at least in theory, move into a service or office role. A worker whose cognitive tasks are being absorbed by AI has a much narrower set of places left to go. The numbers back this up in a way that's hard to wave off as hype. Goldman Sachs' head of global economics research, Joseph Briggs, projects that under a base case scenario, it will take roughly a decade for firms to adopt AI at scale, and that 6 to 7% of workers will be displaced during that transition. That sounds almost mild until you remember what 6 or 7% of the American workforce actually is in raw human terms, millions of households. And Briggs himself has said the real question isn't whether this happens, it's how fast. If the adoption timeline compresses instead of stretching over 10 years, the impact on the economy grows substantially larger than the base case predicts. Entry-level workers in their 20s and 30s, especially those heading into knowledge and content creation roles, are positioned to feel it first and hardest. Other estimates are more dramatic still. Goldman Sachs has separately estimated that AI could eventually replace the equivalent of 300 million full-time jobs worldwide, touching roughly a quarter of all work tasks across the U.S. and Europe, while simultaneously projecting that the same technology could lift global GDP by around 7% through new industries and productivity gains. The IMF has found that roughly 40% of jobs worldwide carry some exposure to AI, and that figure jumps to about 60% once you narrow the lens to advanced economies like the United States. Nearly a fifth of American workers could see more than half of their daily tasks touched by AI in some way, and roughly 80% of the workforce could have at least a tenth of their tasks influenced by large language models, concentrated heavily in office work. Only a small sliver of workers, under a quarter by some counts, currently sit in roles considered largely insulated from this shift. This isn't abstract modeling anymore either. It's showing up in actual corporate announcements. In 2025, roughly 55,000 U.S. job cuts were explicitly and publicly attributed to AI automation. According to tracking firm Challenger, Gray, and Christmas, more than 12 times the number tied to AI just 2 years earlier. Workday cut about 1,750 jobs, roughly 5% of its workforce, and said the money was being redirected into AI investment. Amazon eliminated 14,000 corporate roles, framing the move around leaner structures and faster innovation. The payments company Block shrank its workforce from around 10,000 employees down to 6,000, citing AI's growing ability to handle fraud detection, risk assessment, and customer support on its own. Meta made headlines in the spring of 2026 with a plan to cut close to 8,000 jobs, even while pouring somewhere between $115 and $135 billion into AI infrastructure for that year alone. Read that twice. The same companies cutting people are spending record sums building the systems replacing them. Now picture a specific person living through this, because statistics don't hit the way a face does. Imagine a mid-level marketing manager named Jordan, 34 years old, based just outside Atlanta. Jordan has spent a decade climbing into a role overseeing brand campaigns for a mid-sized retail company. For years, the job felt safe precisely because it required taste, storytelling instinct, and understanding of what actually makes people feel something. Then the company rolls out an AI system that can draft ad copy, generate visual concepts, run A/B tests, and optimize a campaign budget across a dozen channels, all before lunch. At first, it's just a tool that makes Jordan faster. Within 18 months, the department that used to need 9 people needs 3, and Jordan is the one asked to manage the AI system instead of a team of humans. Jordan kept a job. 6 colleagues didn't. That is, in miniature, what economists mean when they talk about the seniorization of entry-level work. Junior roles either disappearing or getting rebuilt to demand senior-level judgment from day one. This pattern shows up clearly in the data on younger workers specifically. Big Tech's hiring of new college graduates has fallen by nearly half compared to pre-pandemic levels. Wall Street firms are collectively cutting somewhere around 200,000 roles, concentrated heavily in entry-level analyst positions. A 2026 industry report tracking AI's effect on jobs found that new tasks being layered onto AI-exposed roles are 2.5 times more likely to depend on skills like empathy, judgment, creativity, the very things AI still struggles to replicate, because AI is absorbing the routine parts of the job and leaving the harder, more human parts behind. That same research found AI-exposed junior roles are now 7 times more likely than the least exposed junior roles to demand traditionally senior skills like leadership and strategic thinking, and that these seniorized entry-level roles have grown 35% since 2019, even as ordinary junior postings in AI-heavy sectors have flatlined. The traditional ladder, good grades, good school, entry-level job, work your way up, is being compressed into something almost unrecognizable. Companies still want junior-level salaries. They just want senior-level output from the person earning them. It isn't only white-collar office work either. Picture a warehouse outside Memphis where robotic systems now handle inventory sorting through the night without a single human on the floor. Picture long-haul trucking, an industry employing more than 3 million Americans, facing the slow creep of autonomous vehicle technology that doesn't need sleep, doesn't need breaks, and doesn't file for overtime. Picture customer service, where studies estimate up to 80% of customer service roles could eventually be automated, and where nearly half of administrative tasks and 44% of legal tasks are already technically automatable with current tools. Legal work is a particularly striking case. The tasks disappearing first are document review and contract analysis, the exact bread and butter work that used to be how first-year lawyers earned their stripes before eventually becoming partners. So who's actually making the decision to cut these jobs, and why now? Partly it's genuine capability. The tools have simply gotten good enough. But there's a second, less flattering explanation showing up in the data too. Throughout 2025, as companies faced inflation, rising costs, and pressure to protect margins, AI became a convenient, headline-friendly justification for workforce reductions that were, at least in part, about cutting costs during a difficult economic stretch. It's a useful story for a company to tell shareholders, not we're struggling, but we're transforming. Whether every single one of those layoffs was truly driven by AI capability or partly driven by AI as a convenient excuse is genuinely disputed among economists, and it matters because it changes how permanent these losses actually are. What happens next is where the real argument in economics right now is playing out, and it centers on one uncomfortable question. If fewer people are earning steady paychecks, who keeps buying things? Research modeling this exact scenario points out that the top 20% of American income earners already account for somewhere between roughly 47 and 65% of all consumer spending, with a central estimate landing around 59%. That means the American economy is already unusually dependent on a relatively narrow band of high earners. If AI displacement is concentrated among middle-income knowledge workers, which is exactly where the data suggests it's landing, the households losing income are disproportionately the ones whose spending keeps the broader consumer economy moving. Economists have started calling the result a K-shaped economy, a pattern where businesses serving wealthier zip codes keep growing, while businesses in lower and middle income areas see slower demand and increasingly negative consumer sentiment. Higher income households have been saving more and pulling back only slightly, while lower income households increasingly lean on debt to keep spending, with delinquency rates, especially on auto loans, already ticking upward as a warning sign. There's a deeper structural version of this worry too. One economic analysis published in early 2026 lays it out starkly. When AI lets a company do more with fewer workers, the productivity gains tend to flow toward corporate profits and shareholder wealth rather than toward the paychecks of the workers who got displaced. And while corporations feel the profit upside within a matter of quarters, the average consumer doesn't feel the employment shock for another 2 to 4 quarters after that. A lag that can mask how serious the underlying problem is until it suddenly isn't maskable anymore. Moody's Analytics modeled several scenarios for how this could play out and assigned meaningful probability to a version where substantial job losses occur across industries where AI can perform most tasks, while too few new jobs appear in other sectors to absorb the displaced workers, because overall consumer demand gets stunted by an increasingly skewed distribution of income and wealth. In that scenario, the economy doesn't just lose jobs, it loses the demand that would normally pull it back into balance, and the downturn becomes self-reinforcing. Naturally, this has pulled a policy idea back from the fringes into the center of mainstream conversation: universal basic income. This isn't a new concept. Andrew Yang built his entire 2020 presidential campaign around it, warning that automation would cost roughly 1 in 3 American workers their jobs within 12 years, and proposing a $1,000 monthly freedom dividend funded through a value-added tax. What's changed is who's saying it now. OpenAI's Sam Altman has floated basic income concepts for years. Elon Musk has gone further, describing a future of universal high income, where robots and AI handle most material production and traditional employment becomes optional rather than necessary for survival. In February 2026, a British government minister, Lord Jason Stockwood, told the Financial Times the UK was actively weighing some form of UBI specifically to cushion industries where AI threatens to eliminate large numbers of jobs, alongside proposals to tax AI-driven productivity gains to fund it. Some economists now frame UBI less as an ideological experiment and more as a macroeconomic stabilization mechanism, arguing that the real question isn't whether AI raises productivity. It clearly does, but whether that productivity keeps translating into broad wage growth, or whether it increasingly pools with the people who already own the technology. Even Modi himself, the loudest voice warning about job losses, has proposed something adjacent: a small tax on AI model usage to help fund the transition for displaced workers, alongside government-funded retraining programs. In one appearance alongside JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, Modi reached for economic history to frame his own uncertainty, invoking something called the Jevons paradox, the 19th century observation that when a technology makes a process more efficient, demand for that process often expands rather than shrinks, meaning the technology ends up creating more total work rather than less. Automate 90% of a job, the theory goes, and the remaining 10% doesn't just stay 10%. It expands to fill the space, and workers become far more productive within that shrunken slice. Dimon made a blunter version of the same argument, pointing to agriculture, electricity, and the internet as proof that capitalist economies are remarkably good at recreating jobs after old ones disappear. But Modi added an important caveat in the very same breath. This technology is moving faster than any of the historical examples people use to reassure themselves, and the mechanisms that eventually rebalanced labor markets after past disruptions needed time. Time for markets to notice new demand, time for workers to retrain, time for employers to expand instead of simply shrink. If AI compresses a multi-decade transition into a handful of years, there may not be enough time left for the reassuring part of the story to actually happen, before the disruptive part does the damage. History is, admittedly, mostly on the side of the optimists, and it would be dishonest to leave that out. Economic historians have tallied roughly 5 million U.S. jobs destroyed since 1980 by the rise of personal computing and the internet, entire occupational categories that shrank dramatically or vanished, while simultaneously, millions of new jobs were created directly in computer hardware manufacturing, semiconductor production, software development, and an entire computer-enabled service economy that didn't exist before. Telephone operators are the classic case study. Between 1871 and 1971, the number of telephone and telegraph operators in the UK grew by a factor of 40 as the phone network expanded, before automated switchboards, the internet and mobile phones arrived and caused that same profession to collapse just as dramatically. The steam engine displaced hand weavers and sparked the Luddite riots, then indirectly created millions of factory, construction, and transportation jobs. The assembly line and the automobile wiped out the horse and carriage economy and created entire new industries around it. Every wave of automation in the past 2 centuries has followed roughly the same rhythm. Sharp, visible destruction in the old category, followed by slower, less visible, harder to predict creation in categories nobody saw coming beforehand. The honest caveat, the one serious economists keep repeating, is that history is not a guarantee, it's a pattern, and patterns can break. One researcher studying AI's labor impact put the core worry simply. In the Industrial Revolution, machines mostly took over physical tasks, and humans still had all the cognitive tasks left to do. This time, as machines start absorbing cognitive tasks too, it's a genuinely open question, what's left for people to do instead? There is, in other words, no economic law guaranteeing that the next wave of jobs created will equal or exceed the wave destroyed. It has worked out that way roughly every generation for 200 years. It does not have to work out that way this time, and nobody, not a Modi, not Altman, not the Federal Reserve, not a single economist quoted anywhere in this research, can promise you which way it goes. So what actually holds up, at least for now? The research is remarkably consistent on this point across dozens of different studies and industry reports. Jobs anchored in physical unpredictability, emotional presence, or legal and moral accountability remain the most resistant. Nurses, physical therapists, and mental health counselors sit near the top of nearly every AI-resistant ranking, because clinical work depends on physical assessment and human trust in ways current AI simply can't replicate. Commercial airline pilots score among the highest AI resistance ratings in independent index studies, precisely because their value lies in handling the unexpected. Mechanical failures, weather emergencies, rather than the routine flying that autopilot already handles. Judges score similarly high, since their work depends on weighing nuanced, sometimes contradictory evidence, and maintaining public legitimacy in a way AI-assisted research can support but not substitute for. Skilled trades, electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, remain difficult to automate because they require physical dexterity in constantly changing environments, the kind of messy, real-world variability that trips up even sophisticated robotics. One analysis found less than 5% of occupations can currently be fully automated with existing technology, even though roughly 60% have at least partial automation exposure in specific tasks, meaning most jobs aren't disappearing outright so much as being restructured around whatever slice AI can't yet touch. New categories of work are also genuinely emerging, not as a hypothetical, but already right now on job boards. AI trainers who fine-tune model behavior, prompt engineers, AI ethics and governance consultants, human AI collaboration managers, whose entire job is deciding which tasks stay human and which get handed to a model, robotics maintenance technicians, cybersecurity specialists defending against AI-powered attacks. The World Economic Forum has projected roughly 78 million net new jobs emerging by 2030, specifically in fields built around distinctly human skills: empathy, physical dexterity, creative judgment, even as older, more routine roles shrink in parallel. A separate global analysis of over 1 billion job postings found that companies most exposed to AI are actually showing productivity growth about 40% higher than the least exposed companies, and that many of those AI-heavy companies are raising both wages and headcount faster than companies barely touched by the technology, suggesting a genuine two-track labor market is forming rather than a uniform collapse. That's an important nuance nobody wants to shout about, because it complicates the doom narrative. AI adoption and job growth are not automatically opposites. In some companies, right now they're moving together. Go back to Jordan, the marketing manager in Atlanta. 6 months after the department shrinks, Jordan isn't managing ad copy anymore. Jordan is managing the relationship between the brand and its most valuable customers, work that depends on reading a room, sensing when a campaign feels tone deaf before it launches, negotiating with agency partners who are themselves half panicked about their own future. None of that shows up on an org chart as AI-proof, but it's exactly the kind of judgment-heavy, socially complex work that stays stubbornly human even as the mechanical parts of the job get automated out from under it. Jordan didn't outcompete the AI. Jordan moved to the part of the job the AI still can't reach. That distinction between competing against AI and repositioning around it is probably the single most useful idea buried inside all of this research, and it applies whether you're a marketing manager, a paralegal, a customer service rep, or a truck dispatcher. A junior designer in 2026 is already spending less time resizing image assets and more time making the creative calls that actually shape a campaign. A marketing coordinator is spending less time formatting spreadsheets and more time interpreting what the data in front of them actually means. The floor of what counts as entry level is rising. That's uncomfortable if you're trying to break into a field the old-fashioned way, doing the grunt work first and earning judgment later. But it also means the work that survives is, almost by definition, more interesting and more valuable than what came before it. It's worth pausing on one more piece of this puzzle that rarely gets mentioned in the more sensational coverage: age. Younger workers report far more anxiety about this shift than older ones. Surveys show workers aged 18 to 24, are roughly 129% more likely to fear losing their job to AI compared with older colleagues. And among that same age group, just over half say they're worried AI will hurt their career prospects specifically. That gap makes intuitive sense once you think about it. Older workers often have decades of accumulated relationships, institutional knowledge, and judgment calls behind them, the exact things AI still struggles to replicate. Younger workers are frequently hired precisely due to the repetitive, structured, pattern-based tasks that AI is best at, which means the newest people in the workforce are, statistically, standing closest to the blast radius. Fully remote workers report elevated worry too, roughly 42% more likely than average, to believe AI will disrupt their job. Likely because remote, digital-first roles tend to be easier to automate than jobs requiring a physical body in a physical room. And within specific industries, the anxiety maps almost perfectly onto exposure. In advertising and marketing specifically, just over half of workers expect their job to change meaningfully because of generative AI, which lines up with what happened to Jordan's department in Atlanta almost exactly. There's also a geographic and sectoral texture to this story that's easy to miss if you only look at national averages. Not every part of the country, not every industry, is being hit at the same speed. Finance hubs, consulting-heavy metro areas, and tech corridors are absorbing the earliest and sharpest disruption, because that's where the AI-exposed white-collar roles are concentrated in the first place. Meanwhile, sectors built around physical labor in unpredictable environments, construction, skilled trades, emergency response, are seeing comparatively little disruption so far. Only around 6% of construction tasks and 4% of maintenance tasks are currently considered suitable for AI automation, a striking contrast to the roughly 65% of data processing and information handling tasks that fall into the automatable category. If you're picturing this as one uniform wave crashing over the entire economy at once, that's not quite right. It's closer to water finding cracks, flowing fastest into the roles built around predictable digital pattern-based work and pooling much more slowly everywhere else. It's also worth being honest about the timeline itself, because even among people who broadly agree AI will be disruptive, there's real disagreement about how fast. Some analysts estimate that fully automating half of all current global work tasks could still take another 20 years, even accounting for how quickly the technology itself is improving. A reminder that building a capable model in a lab is a very different thing from a hospital system, a regional law firm, or a small manufacturing company actually rewiring their entire workflow around it. Adoption inside large tech companies, which are naturally the fastest movers, still lags behind the pace outside implied by the technology's raw capability. One widely cited example. Amadei predicted in early 2025 that AI would soon be writing the vast majority of code across the industry within months. Inside Anthropic itself, that turned out to be roughly true. Across the broader non-tech economy, the real figure was closer to a quarter to 40%. And for companies outside the tech sector entirely, it was lower still. That gap between what the technology can do and how fast the average employer actually deploys it is exactly where most of the genuine uncertainty in every prediction in this script is hiding. None of this erases the very real, very immediate pain sitting underneath the optimistic long-run story. Somewhere in this country right now, a paralegal who spent 8 years building expertise in contract review is watching that exact task get absorbed by a tool that costs a company $20 a month. A customer service rep who prided themselves on de-escalating angry callers is being told the AI handles Tier 1 calls now, and only the most complicated, most emotionally charged calls get routed to a human. Which sounds like validation until you realize it means the company needs 1/10 of the staff it used to. Nearly a third of workers globally, according to Pew Research polling cited in industry coverage, already report worry about AI's impact on their own workplace. And that number is climbing, not falling, as 2026 goes on. These aren't abstractions. They're mortgage payments, health insurance, kids' tuition, the ordinary architecture of a stable life. And for a meaningful number of American households, that architecture is being tested right now in real time. What almost every serious voice in this debate agrees on, whether they lean toward Amodei's alarm or Diamond's historical optimism, is that the outcome isn't predetermined by the technology alone. It's determined by choices, corporate choices about whether AI gets used to do the same work with fewer people or more work with the same people, policy choices about whether gains get taxed and redistributed or allowed to concentrate, educational choices about whether the next generation gets trained to operate these systems or simply trained to compete against them and lose. Amodei himself framed it as a binary. Companies can do the same thing with fewer resources, which produces layoffs, or they can do more with the same resources, which requires actual creativity and intention rather than just cost-cutting with extra steps. Left entirely to short-term incentives, most companies under margin pressure will default to the first option. because it shows up on a quarterly earnings call in a way the second option doesn't. So where does that leave an ordinary person trying to plan the next 5 years of their working life? Sitting somewhere between the CEO predicting a bloodbath and the CEO predicting abundance. Probably somewhere unglamorous, but genuinely useful. Build fluency with these tools rather than avoiding them, because the data consistently shows AI-literate workers inside AI-exposed roles are the ones getting raises and promotions, not the ones getting cut. Lean toward the parts of your work that involve judgment, persuasion, physical presence, or trust, the parts that show up in literally every AI-resistant study as the hardest to automate. Stay skeptical of any confident prediction, including the ones in this script, because the honest state of expert opinion right now is genuine, serious disagreement among people with access to the same data. And take the emotional weight of this moment seriously without letting it become paralyzing, because the workers who come out ahead in every previous technological transition weren't the ones who waited for certainty. They were the ones who started adapting while the picture was still blurry. The debate over whether AI ends up destroying the American middle class or ultimately rebuilding it around better, more human work is not going to be settled by a single statistic or a single confident CEO. It's going to be settled slowly, industry by industry, household by household, over the back half of this decade, by millions of individual decisions made by companies, governments, and workers who are all, right now in 2026, feeling their way through something genuinely unprecedented. The technology isn't waiting for anyone to figure out the answer before it keeps improving. The only real question left is whether the people, the institutions, and the policies built to absorb this kind of shock can move anywhere near as fast as the thing they're trying to absorb.